So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this roundtable in conjunction with the Olafur Eliasson exhibition Baroque, which will open tonight at the Winter Palais. And we have Olafur himself in the panel, and two very illustrious guests, Mirjam Schaub, who is a professor of aesthetics and cultural philosophy at the University of Applied Science in Hamburg, and Aurélien Barrau, who is a French physicist, philosopher, specializing in anthroparticle physics, black holes, and cosmology. Will moderate the talk Daniela Zyman, who is chief curator at GBA 21, and with me was the co-curator of the exhibition itself. Good evening, enjoy this.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us here in this wonderful Baroque environment. We are proposing to discuss today the question of world making, of creating worlds from various perspectives, from perspective of astrophysics, of philosophy, of the history of ideas, of the history of thought within the Baroque and outside of the Baroque, with the history of aesthetics and the production of art. So various angles and various point of views of how to talk and think about making worlds. We'll be free-floating in this space of Baroque thinking. Free-floating and folding one idea into the other is probably permissible. But we start with the matter, with the dark matter, right away. I would like to ask Aurélien to explain to us and to talk to us a little bit about worlds, many worlds, multiple worlds, and their dark sides from the point of view of astrophysics.
Good evening, and first of all, forgive me for my Frenchman English. I will try my best. So, I'm supposed to be a scientist, and especially a cosmologist, someone who tries to understand something to the universe. What are we doing as scientists? Well, of course, defining science is a very complicated question that I will not solve with you today. But one might naively argue that science is, first of all, a link with mathematics. This is correct, but this is not completely true, because human sciences do not use mathematics, and because even within natural sciences, neither ethology nor taxonomy use mathematics. Well, one might argue that science is basically what is looking for the truth, or maybe what is telling us the truth. This is also, I think, very naive, because each time there is a change of paradigm, that is, a change of description of the world, in physics, for example, the ontology is completely redefined, which means that if truth exists, and this is probably something we can question, we are somehow always infinitely far from truth. So one might then argue that science is rationality, logos, as would say the ancient Greeks. But rationality is very ill-defined. We are all the irrationals of our opponents. So, in my view, I would say that science is first of all a kind of tension, or maybe a kind of discomfort, as would the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa say, between, on the one hand, creativity, because a theorist is a creator, he invents a model, but on the other hand, a kind of implacable factuality of reality that cannot be circumvented. I mean, nature is not only the mirror of our soul, but neither it is something which is just given to discover. We have to face it and therefore to invent it. I think that the first gesture that we should choose as a scientist is humility. What does the universe look like? Maybe you want me to answer you this question. I don't know. There are many different answers. We have to be very humble. For example, our eyes just see a teeny part of all the possible lights. If you look at the sky with light of low energy that you cannot see by your eyes, but which do exist, you see something completely different. You see a gas of galaxy in the radio frequencies. If you look into microwave frequencies, you see the relic radiation from the Big Bang. This is completely different. If you look in infrared frequencies, you see the environment of the black hole at the center of our galaxy. If you see in ultraviolets, you see the relic elements from the Big Bang. If you look in X-rays, you see very hot objects like white dwarfs. And if you look in gamma rays, you, for example, discover something like a pulsar which emits relativistic particles. My point is that all those phases are real, although they are all different. There is no privileged single face of the universe. I have just said about a pulsar emitting relativistic particles. You know, relativity is really the key theory for us, because it teaches us something fundamental. Space and time can be exchanged one into the other. It teaches us that travels in time in the future are possible. All of us could become older than our parents if they are still alive. We know how to do that. We don't have the technology to do it, but we know what should be done. And furthermore, relativity teaches us something very important, I think also for an artist. You know, E equals mc squared. It means that a property, the energy, can be changed into a being, the mass. This is something fundamental which completely deconstructs the usual ontology. And this is what we are doing, for example, in a particle collider. We are transforming motion, speed if you want, into existence. We are not creating ex nihilo, we are creating ex motion. From motion, we create new particles. We can use those particles to discover new faces of the universe. For example, consider neutrinos. Neutrinos are ghost particles. They can travel through the stars and through the intergalactic medium without being altered. This is fundamental, because when you look at the sun with your eyes, you just see the surface of the sun. We see a skin of star. So I know the French poet Paul Valéry, often cited by the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, was saying that there is nothing deeper than skin. But in these particular circumstances, there is a nuclear body, which is exactly what you want to see. One could also use cosmic rays, for example, to search for antimatter. Are there islands of antimatter in the universe with right now anti-artists discussing with anti-scientists? That's possible. We don't know. And finally, I have in mind what we call gravitational waves. They are riddles of space-time. They are vibration of the geometry predicted by the great theory of Einstein. This means something fundamental. This means that space and time are not anymore, as Kant or Newton would have thought, the place where phenomena take place. It means that space and time are themselves phenomenon. They are evolving. They are dynamical. The expansion of the universe is just the motion of space in itself. Of course, there are problems. We are able to say something about the history of the universe, but problems are consubstantial to scientific and, I think, to artistic thinking. We don't know what happens inside black holes, where probably space and time exchange each other. We don't know what is dark matter, most of the mass of the universe. And we don't know what is dark energy, which is the origin of the very curious acceleration of the expansion of the universe. And even worse, we don't really know what it means to have a Big Bang, what it means to have a beginning of space and a beginning of time. Even worse, are there other universes, what we call a multiverse? We don't know if they exist, and we don't even know if this question itself is well defined. I think that those interrogations are not orthogonal to the ones of Olafur Eliasson, and this is probably why I was invited tonight. For several reasons. First, because, and this is probably something that is important in this Baroque environment, we are all playing with light. Light is a tool, but it is more than a tool. It is our access to reality. Maybe it is a quintessence of reality itself. Why is dark matter so strange for physicists? Not because it has very strange properties, but just because it does not emit nor reflect light. Without light, we are lost. Second, because I mean, we are all interested also, I think, in the dark side. And this is especially meaningful in a Baroque environment. If I can refer to the famous classification by Wolflin, one of the characteristics of Baroque times for him, when opposed to classical times, is that in Baroque painting, darkness is not only, as in classical paintings, a way to guide the eyes toward light. Darkness is also something in itself. Darkness, the dark side, is valuable, is meaningful in itself. And this is exactly what we discover as physicists. And third, probably because the French painter Soulages, probably one of the masters of black color, said, and I think that the work of Olafur Eliasson shows that, what is in between the work of art and our eyes is part of the work of art. I think this is especially meaningful for an artist like him, who, for whom it is important also to consider art outside the museum. And for a physicist like me, who discovers, thanks to Einstein, that space is itself a physical object. And finally, to conclude, and probably most importantly, because I have read that Olafur Eliasson calls sometimes works of art reality-producing machines. I absolutely love this sentence, and I cannot agree more. Because, you know, sometimes science is described the other way around as reality-discovering machine. And I disagree with that. I think, like him, I am also a reality creator. I think, and on this point, I would follow the words of the American philosopher Nelson Goodman. I think we are all world makers. We are all making, inventing, constructing symbolic systems, but with different rules and with different constraints, of course. I think we are fundamentally deconstructing the very idea of a ready-made reality. So, in my mind, this is slightly more than a touching point between us. This is maybe a condensation state, and physics teaches us that those states can be followed by big bangs. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurélien. So before I ask the anti-artist to reply to that, I would ask the anti-philosophist maybe to ponder with us for a moment on the question whether making worlds is always a remaking, whether making worlds also always starts from our world here and now, and is actually a matter of composing and recomposing the elements of our world.
Well, Daniela, what you're saying is exactly what the great Baroque philosopher Leibniz would say. He would say, we should not think of creation of the new deriving out of nothing. The new is a new combination of what is already there, and these combinations are infinite. It is an infinite world of possibilities that can be recombined. And so the effect is new, but the elements are very old. And this also gives us, in a way, trust into what is new. This makes us accept the newness of it, I'd say.
Maybe a few words on Leibniz and the way he creates his universes inside.
Yes, I think Leibniz is very important for the whole Baroque ideas. He, of course, as a philosopher, was also an engineer, which is quite interesting. So he really invented things in law. He invented coal mines. He invented a calculus. He was even an inventor in calculating machines.
So he was very prolific in what he did. But for this situation and room here, he had a direct contact to Prince Eugene, which is interesting enough. And in the end of his life, Prince Eugene asked him to put his metaphysics short in order to make it comprehensible to the prince. And so Leibniz broke down his metaphysics, which is very interesting because it is a conception of multiple worlds from the very start. Because Leibniz was very aware that we have, he was writing in French, petite perception, that we have, that we know things without knowing it, that our perception deals with vibrations and with things that do not mean anything, but they are there and they can become meaningful. So he had the idea that every soul is in touch with everything which happened before and what is going to happen. And this, of course, is a beautiful means of linking and overbridging, of course, differences and trying to bring the universe together. And one thing he was particularly interested in are mirrors, and mirrors bring us back to Olafur Eliasson's work because it is the main intervention in the new exhibition that we are followed and awaited by mirrors. In every room there is one, a big oversized mirror that is also inhaling, moving. It is not it is a film, it is a movable, a vibrating object. And for Leibniz, the mirror has nothing to do with self-control, it has nothing to do with vanity, it has nothing to do with the fugativeness of time. It has to do with completion and perfection. So the mirror is a machine, it is a Baroque machine, it is a tool to complete and to decentralize the human gaze, which would, without the mirror, could never be completed. And I would invite you to see the mirror as a means for completion and to get to know that perfection in the Baroque was something doable. It was something that you could attain with skills and with deliberation. And it is a very fundamental idea in striving for perfection.
Thank you, Mirjam. Olafur. Maybe two ideas I would like to pick up from Aurélien, two of the many, and I hope I'm not over-interpreting. But one is the movement of perception, right? If we look at perception as this ability to sort of rescan, reinvent, reorganize, re-explore, and our environments in all its multifaceted ways. And then the other is the idea of order. I think ordering, systems of order, also the way that we represent color in the color spectrum, the way we represent temperatures and so on. So in some ways, these two elements are so important in your work, as I see. Are they sort of tools in creating worlds and artistic processes such as the exhibition that we have?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me, and hello everybody. Wow, such good company I'm in. Excellent, excellent. The perception as a kind of reality machine or as a kind of constructing element, I think is a healthy exercise in terms of, I think we, in our numbness, take it for granted that reality is real, and not that there's something wrong with it exactly, except in the moment you would like to change it. Make it better maybe or so. And this means that, of course, the idea that a changeable reality is, I think, much more healthy, as it also suggests that the people in it are, in fact, the protagonists who are making it. And obviously we are also surrounded by systems, political systems or commercial systems or various systems who seems to profit from suggesting that reality is not really negotiable. Because if it's negotiable, it can change, and this means that it's destable, and so on and so forth. So for me, perception is to kind of look into the structure of perception in this way is also really about investigating, well, to what extent can we actually allow people to sort of take over the production of reality or reality as such. I mean, who owns it in terms of, is it something that we consume, that we are surrounded by, and then we take it in? Or is it something that we produce? And it's obviously still surrounding us, but it is something which is consequential of how you are in it. And for an artist, or in terms of art making, I think it's you know, this idea of that reality is relative is really also a critical mean, because it's, I think, is about also exercising trust and you know, suggesting that people are actually smart enough to sort of take over their own reality and produce their own reality. And as we know that museums, for instance, are very much evaluating to what extent do they trust the people like you here tonight? Do we trust you to actually make sense of how you come in and use and make real what you see in the museum? Or do we need to assist you and speak? And now it's interesting. We think we speak on your behalf, but actually we speak on your expense, right? And this is the question of whether reality is something you produce or something that the museum produces for you. So I think this is the sort of perception. And now I forgot the other question you had.
More about order and systems of.
Yeah, the order question. I actually thought a lot about how to put the mirror into the exhibition, which I hope you will have a chance to see later. But in the show there is a very large mirror that sort of goes through the exhibition. It's very long. One should think that by doubling the space, as one sort of think when you put a mirror in a space, one should think that it would create more. But what I think seems to be happening is that there is less. Because first of all, you took away the wall that is behind the mirror, so you don't see that. You don't have to deal with, you know, 1 out of 4 walls. So now you have taken 25% of the space away, so there's less material, you could say. Luckily, that is the wall where all the windows is and the outside, so I also have eliminated this sort of the concept of the exterior. And of course, what I thought was so interesting, because this kind of decentralization of the human gaze, what a lovely way of saying it, because what we see in the mirror is, of course, not the double of the space in which we are standing. We actually see the space in which we are standing from the outside of the space. And this is why it's so interesting, because so it's not a reflection of the space. We are seeing the space in a third-person point of view with us in it, right? And we all know that we can't see ourselves normally, right? I can't look at myself, right? I can see my hand, but I can't see myself in the space. Something interesting, I'm sure, could be said about this, but you know, so in a way, suddenly the mirror allows for something that we would otherwise not be able to see, and that's where it becomes a machine. It allows us to see something which is real, and in the process of doing that, it introduces an order. Is always such a, you know, yeah, for an artist that's never really a nice word, but you know what I mean. The point is it does introduce an ability to see or surveil, maybe, if it's like order, your own gaze from the outside. So you both see into the mirror, but you also see yourself seeing. And if I can just finalize that point, so this type of introspective seeing is like 2 perspectives at the same time, right? I both see and I see my seeing is also, I think, where we find identification, because this is the moment where we actually can allocate the space an ability to hold us in it. So we allow for the space to see us from the perspective of the space. Suddenly we have in terms of ontology, I guess, suddenly we can see ourselves from the outside. That's not how I wanted to say it. The identification point for me is more psychological, because it seems to suggest that the space has a certain ability. You could give it a certain agency or performativity. You know, we could call it hospitality. And you can suddenly in this moment also start to talk about, well, what spaces execute what force or order on us in its way to hold us, right? So hospitality is an agent, and it is an agent which has intentionality. A space is never just a neutral holding thing. It's always a producing reality machine, if you want, just like we are it. So there is a meeting up between different trajectories, the one of us and the one of the space. And this space also has intentions. This space, as you can see, is totally full of intentions. And so on and so forth. And this, I think, is, I always say this at the end of every sentence since I came to Vienna, this, I think, is very Baroque. And then, finally, I just went, what a great title. I will call my next show, Without Light, We Are Lost. That's a brilliant. So.
I think Mirjam wanted to comment.
Yes, what is so striking is that these huge mirrors do not only show us, it shows a multiplicity, it shows a community yet to come. What I found, they have you call it hospitality, I would call it more neutral, a social aspect. It is an invitation together. It is an invitation to become somebody else. It is an invitation to do something, even as strangers who meet together in this space. And I think this was very obvious in the weather project, when people tried or started to form words out of their bodies while they were lying on the bottom of the turbine hull and were sending messages in verse letters, and yet years before Twitter came up. So I like this idea that these oversized mirrors offer the idea of a community to come and of a better people to come. I think it's an invitation to think about future and to think about being guests on this world.
Aurélien, would you like to comment? Or
yes, with pleasure. First, Olafur, I remember the last time we met, you wanted to borrow from me Space is Gravity. So I would be delighted to give you titles for any future work of ours. I am deeply honored about that.
Title machine. Oh, yeah.
Okay, more seriously, just a few words about Leibniz, maybe, because of course he is an incredible philosopher, and when we think about multiple worlds, his name comes immediately. But in Leibniz's view, I think multiple worlds are somehow virtual. There is only one actual world. There are possible worlds, but they are not actual worlds. I think in the history of philosophy, maybe in the ancient times, people like Anaximander, or at the Renaissance time, people like Nicolas de Cuse, Rabelais, or Giordano Bruno, and even in contemporary times, people like David Lewis or Nelson Goodman, for completely different reasons, of course, might also be useful because they probably have been deeper into the idea of multiple worlds that are real, that are actual, that are consubstantial, and of course most of them are not somewhere else in a metric sense. They are not 1,000 kilometers away. I mean, what is the distance between a poem from Rimbaud and a poem from Baudelaire? You just cannot measure it in terms of length. They are just not the same. So most of those multiple worlds are somehow parallel worlds. This term should be taken with care, but I think this is an idea which is very, very important. Also, about order, I think this is something fundamental, because, you know, I'm supposed to be a cosmologist. And cosmology is a conjunction of two words. One is logos, so logos is rationality, but initially it was also language and even oral language. And the other word is cosmos. And in ancient Greek, many words have different meanings. For example, cosmos is both the universe and it contains an idea of order, which means that order seems to be consubstantial to the very idea of the universe. And I think this is something we are right now trying to deconstruct. Maybe I would like to define myself as a chaologist and not only as a cosmologist, because we are trying to learn, and I think art is helping us a lot here, also to deal with disorder, I mean to make sense of disorder. If you look at most sacred or texts or most histories of the universe, either the Bible or the Theogony of Hesiodus or the Metamorphoses of Ovid, etc., it always begins by order. Because before order happens, there is nothing to understand. There is nothing to deal with. The order is somehow the other name of the world in itself. This is maybe something we are just trying to change right now. And just a final word about ontology. Of course, we are not going to solve this huge question tonight, but I think the key point about what Olafur is saying, and what you are saying too, probably, is that what is our fundamental ontology? What are the fundamental objects we are deciding to deal with? Of course, there is something which is not our decision. I mean, the stars will be probably there, even if we all die tonight. Which I don't hope so. The stars will still be there, for sure. But the reason why we call them stars might change. This is the point. You know, the world has been thought as a collection of things. Then it has been thought as a collection of state of affairs. And maybe it's also time to consider it as a collection of relations. I mean, the answers are most of the time somehow objectives. But the questions are our freedom. And I have visited the exhibition of Olafur this afternoon, and it was completely clear to me that he has created a huge number of new questions that would have never come to my mind without his works of art. So in my mind, he is not a creator of matter for sure, neither am I. He is a creator of new questions, and then reality gives the answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Olafur, you've also worked obviously a lot on senses and the ability of our senses to perceive. We talked about that. But how do you see sort of new neuroscience and neuroscientific exploration and research and abilities to, for instance, enhance sensorial experiences? Do you think there is a future of world making in our ability to extend the ability of the skin, for instance, to perceive more or more intensely elements of our environment, the abilities of the eyes, the hearing, you can go endlessly. I know neuroscience is very close to your interest. Can you explore?
Yeah, I think it starts with understanding that the senses, all of them are to a much greater extent than we think actually cultural products, or they have been cultivated. Of course, we are born with some some biomatrix and so on and so forth, but generally, I would like to suggest that the way we sense our surroundings is a big construct. And if you accept that, this sensory contract can also be modified. Right. So I think the senses are not likely to change until we actually focus on them and, well, you could say deconstruct them if you want, and then reconstruct them in this new modus. And of course, art and culture in general is somehow always, and has always been about the kind of recomposing of the sensorial contract. I think in my case I've been looking more on the sort of social neurology that has to do with empathy patterns and compassion-based and inclusion systems, and to what extent and under what conditions can we actually share, for instance, a space. The debate about public space, is public actually inclusive or exclusive? And of course, there's a political or socio-political dimension to this, or social scientific element, which has to do with societal kind of constructs of senses too. I think this idea of suggesting, well, people are actually capable of enhancing our senses also fundamentally has to do with that we generally don't use our senses so much that maybe without thinking about it, we have become numb. And it doesn't really take a lot to sort of challenge this numbness. I mean, we have become numb because everybody's pre-digesting everything for us, so we don't have to think. And we have also, for instance, become numb to the things that are harder to quantify, such as temporality, right? So we think then when looking at, a landscape that we can see how big it is, but it actually turns out once you walk through it, the scale becomes explicit by physical activity through temporality or through time, right? So we all know the feeling here in the mountains. You look at the mountains and you wonder whether it's a big mountain far away or a small mountain closer by. And then you have houses and trees that makes it easier. But when you, like me, go to Iceland where there's nothing and it looks like the moon, you can really, or even better, maybe Greenland, because it's so big that it's hard to understand even. You stand there and you look and you are not just able to tell the scale, you are also not able to tell how big your body is, right? So it's not just what I'm seeing outside, it is the way that the outside is also not telling me if I'm here. So this is remarkable, and it's a kind of a mirror again. But the moment you start to walk, you realize, oh, this stone is actually coming closer to me quite fast, and the other stone is not moving. That must be a big stone far away and a small stone close by. Meaning that the walking itself becomes a reality producer, or the time it takes for me to walk through the landscape. And suddenly, by walking, or here in the mountains, I realize not just how big the landscape is, I also realize, oh, I'm actually existing. I'm here. Because I wasn't sure. And of course, if we are, so this has to do with senses in terms of kind of the sort of muscle knowledge, and how our muscles, actually are also our eyes, or our ways of confirming our existence. So, and I've been focusing a lot on what does it mean to physically know something, and what's the discrepancy between actually knowing in theory and also talking about it, right? You know how it is. We always talk about things that we are gonna do, but having said it 5 times, it already feels like we did it, and then we don't have to do it, right? So actually, sometimes we make the mistake to think that the action about the climate maybe is something that is dealt with once we talk about it, right? I'm talking, but I'm actually not really doing anything. So art, again, of course, I always think art is amazing, but art is very much about connecting, thinking, and doing, because you start with an idea, step, model, sketch, model, bigger model, computer model, ask a scientist, ask a curator, and then you have action, right? Actually, the journey is, of course, the action and so on. But you see how creativity, you could say, has been about connecting, thinking, and doing. So the numbness I was talking about, the lack of physical knowledge, or the sensory knowledge, has to do with that we think that thinking about things is the reality-producing element. But a good test is just to stand in a great Icelandic landscape, and then you realize, oh, I probably don't even exist, because I have no sensory contract to stabilize or to prove my presence. So that's my relatively pragmatic relationship with neuroscience.
Hola. Thank you, Olafur. Mirjam, can we think outside of our bodies? No, one question. Second question, maybe more about Baroque thinking and Baroque reason. Maybe sort of this idea that reason not necessarily is like this black matter that is all about order and being extremely well organized, but maybe reason can have... I got it.
We should never think outside our bodies. Never ever do it. If this happens to you, you're in a very bad situation. I mean, this comes to traumatized people, that they suddenly see themselves from above, or women under labor do see themselves from above. And I can tell you from my own experience, this is really a treadmill. This is really a threat of, you know that something utterly is not in place in this situation. So please stay in your bodies, think in your body, be sensual thinkers. This is, I think, a good thing to do. So, second question, rationality in the Baroque. There's a new book on Baroque science by 2 Israeli scientists. One is called Chen Morris, and the other one is called, I forgot actually his name. But it is very interesting because it says that in the Baroque era, of course, the science which we know today started to separate from philosophy. And they started, of course, to estrange themselves from the tactile world. And what is interesting, that at the same time the Baroque artists were, particularly the use of optical elements in Jan Vermeer, you can see his use of the camera obscura. It's very interesting that he embraces the new technology, and he uses it to revolutionize his paintings, his painting style. So he tries to imitate by painting effects he has first seen through the camera obscura, but the effect is to, even in embracing the new science and even in embracing the rationality of the camera obscura, he links it to tactile experience. And this is very fascinating for me. So again, the artist is the one who bridges the gap. It is in the Baroque era the one who says there is no divide between rational and irrational or sensual or abstract. They make the abstract visions of the camera obscura tangible, touchable, and this is so fascinating that they bridge this gap. So what we think, when we think in these opposites, the Baroque era is always thinking it together. They don't see it as, and they like to make the construction visible. For instance, this illusionary painting over our ceiling. Of course, if you stand in the middle of it, you get the full effect. There is an ideal standpoint from which you have the best of it. But if you look at it from one of the sides, when you enter this room, it seems to be anamorphic and distorted. And this is not an accident. The artist knew that there was also an anamorphic aspect, a disruption in it, and he would be happy with them too. He was happy to show the constructiveness of his paintings.
Can I just add to that, because I think this is so interesting, not to cut you off, Mirjam, but for me that is a proof that the Baroque artists actually trusted the people to be smart. Right, so that's something we can learn from, right? So they did this crazy painting. I mean, look at it, it's totally crazy if you think about it. I mean, they must have been mad. And they think people are so smart that they just put the painting and do nothing else, right? They didn't have a sort of a headset to put on people to explain it. Do you know what I mean? Nothing against headsets, but you get the point. But so it hands the responsibility for the creation of the painting to the viewer. So it reverses this idea of the viewer consuming the painting to the viewer producing the painting. And I just think this is very interesting, because the cultural sector seems to be one of the few places where this type of trust-generating principle is supported. Not all the time, but it's just interesting where we think, the cultural sector, we actually think people are smart.
Aurélien, I have a question. I have a question to you, but I'm happy if you weave it into all kinds of speculations, of course, and replies.
Maybe I can just say a few words before your possible question. You have invited us to stay within our bodies, and I completely agree, of course, with the argument. And I think this argument is also another way of inviting us to be very modest in our relation to the world. Because stay in your body, I think, also means move our body. Because if you move your body, you change, of course, the perspective. And I think you might say that changing the perspective changes the world. You might answer, but the world has not really changed. I have just changed my mind or my view about the world. Correct. But the meta world you are referring to here is probably tasteless. This is an empty world that you don't want to fight for. So probably the world which makes sense, which means the one you are in relation with, the one you are fighting against or fighting for, is indeed changing when you move your body. And finally on this point, the French philosopher Bergson was saying, my body is going up to the stars. That's a strange sentence, but that's not a crazy sentence, because actually it is correct that the border of our body is somehow arbitrary. Let's take it the other way around. I might ask you what is the radius of the sun, and if you remember, you will answer me a certain number of kilometers. Something like, I don't know, 700,000 probably. But you might very well say that we are right now within the sun. It completely depends on how you define the sun. If you define the sun not by matter, but by its magnetic field, for example, which is completely real, completely measurable, then the Earth is within the sun. So I think that we can view ourselves, probably philosopher, artist, scientist, as body extensions to the fundamental body. We don't want to leave our bodies, and actually we cannot. leave our bodies. We must keep in mind that we cannot access the eye of God, but we can extend our bodies and trying to see the world at other wavelengths, other energies with other particles, or like Olafur do it by asking new questions. I think it's also a way of making hybridations between our body and body extenders.
Well, I still have a question. So what is the body of science? What is the inside of science? You know, what makes scientific thinking productive in a sense of knowledge production? What do you do with all the mistakes, the failure? How do you delete from science? And how do you sort of negotiate this delay between science and society? I mean, it's a group of questions, but you...
Sure. Gaston Bachelard, the epistemologist, was saying that the history of science is the history of corrected mistakes. And of course, this is a correct view. We were discussing with Olafur just before the conference, and we were arguing that actually in natural, not in mathematics, but in natural sciences, in physics, for example, we can never, of course, prove anything. This is the basis of the epistemology of Karl Popper, who shows us that you can disprove a theory. You can prove that a theory is wrong because you make an experiment and it disagrees with the theory and therefore the theory does not work. This is correct. But you cannot prove that the theory is true because you don't know. Maybe tomorrow you will make another experiment that has not been done to date. Maybe tomorrow you will do the same experiment but with a better accuracy, and then you will discover that your theory doesn't work and it will be disproved. And once a genius comes around, maybe Newton, maybe Einstein, maybe a new one that we don't yet know, the theory will be replaced by a new one which completely changes our relation to the world. So I agree with you that knowledge, well, actually you have not said so, but with what you could have said, that knowledge is somehow cumulative, which means that there is a kind of improvement. This is correct. There is a progress, if you want. But this is true at a technical level. We are able to predict things in a more and more accurate way. Our cell phones are more and more powerful, sure. But at the ontological level, which means at the level of describing the being in themselves, not as tools, then this is far from being obvious. Because each time we change a model, we completely change the grammar we use to describe the world. For example, according to Newton, the moon is turning around the Earth because there is a force, the gravitational force, that is acting on it. And it works very well. According to Einstein, the technical improvement of Einstein is teeny. If you want to compute the orbit of the moon, Newton is enough. Einstein makes only a teeny improvement. But the ontology is completely different. Einstein tells us, no, you're completely wrong. There is no force at all. The moon is moving in straight line, but in a space which is curved by the existence of the Earth. And for sure, in a few years, I hope, at worst centuries, we will have a new quantum theory of gravity which will tell us, no, Einstein is completely wrong. What is happening is this. And my guess is that this game never ends.
Olafur, you have worked a lot with an Icelandic friend and mathematician, geometrician, Einar Thorsten, who has died very recently. I know your collaboration was very intense and very dear. And you know, if we take geometry just for a moment as a system of order, of course, but also as a system of describing the universe, and maybe again looking at your exhibition as kind of an assemblage of Platonic and non-Platonic bodies. You know, can we maybe talk about geometry and your relationship to it? And Einar, who again was very much influenced by Bucky Fuller, who again had this whole energetic universal idea, maybe a little bit of...
Absolutely, yes. And thank you for bringing him up. According to Einar, he is still here, but according to me, he has left us. So it's also interesting in terms of perspective. So, hi Einar, should you be here? But listen, I came to this really because I was interested in what types of, how should I say, critical tools would be offered in terms of better understanding the kind of impact that the rationalization of space has had on our bodies. So I really came to this sort of different mathematical schools, spatial schools, different types of thinking within space-producing theories, out of an interest, well, who has really, different tools to re-evaluate the spatial conditions out of which, for instance, architecture grew. Some of that was the reason why I got the Kiesler Prize, so mentioning because we are here in Austria. And Kiesler, of course, was a protagonist who offered, in a sort of, on a certain angle, a set of tools to reconsider some of the rules that were governing architecture at the time. And there was many others. So my relationship with Aure started that I was very interested in Fuller, and it turned out this Icelandic person who had studied with Frei Otto in the time where Frei was engineering the stadium in Munich, the Olympic Stadium in Munich, where Aure, as a student, were climbing in these sort of 10th century roof structures. So I went up to see Aure as I was preparing a work of art, which was sort of a homage to Fuller. And of course, it turned out that Aure was actually brilliant and had so many different types of knowledges as he has gone further into crystallography studies, into mathematical principles in general, and so on. And interestingly, he was very pre-computer, so he did everything with a pencil on a paper, which I don't think one should romanticize, but it does have a certain charm to it, right? So actually sit and write on paper. And essentially for me it became not about replacing one reality with another. It was more to use these often anthroposophic principles from other architectural strings or spatial strings to suggest that also the governing architectural or spatial regime is a construction, right? So I think he offered me the opportunity to realize that a lot of the things that I took for granted as being fundamental, like they were actually negotiable. And of course this is incredibly liberating, because suddenly you realize, oh, if it doesn't have to be flat, then I can make it curved. And this means that it was in a way an eye-opener for me, and of course a certain element for this was also the sort of the social component of him. Luckily he met a German wife living in Iceland. How lucky is it that I visit him in Iceland, and a few years later he meets a German woman in Berlin and marries her and moves to Berlin. So yeah, so it's like kind of a gravitational issue, I think, and so on and so forth. So he was on a straight line. He was a yes, he was on a straight line, and the world was curved, because it's like I see a new show coming. But, and of course, often, and so this is kind of a longer talk. But I think the kind of ability to also reconsider mathematical principles in the exhibition here at the Winterpalais, there is a tunnel. The tunnel is covered with a grid. That tunnel was actually shown the first time in Graz, some 12. No, what year was it in Graz? 96, I think, right? So a little while ago, and it was actually curated by Christa Steinle, who sits right here in the room with us, which is very exciting. So don't hesitate to celebrate Christa's amazing feat of going through the trouble of making my first show, and also asking Peter Weibel to do it with her, which is like, anyway. So that tunnel was covered with a grid, a mesh, and this is a quasi-crystalline grid, which was, now I forgot the name, but an Englishman discovered that in the 80s. So Aure was looking into these not predictable crystalline growth patterns. I was not knowledgeable about it, but Aure then brought me into that world, and we had contact with this Englishman, asking him if his discovery could be used for art, and he of course said, it's not my, it is the shape of a crystal, anybody can use it as they wish. So that's a typical story, and I suggested, well, let's make a tunnel through which one can go, almost like going through a quasi-crystalline space, like at least suggesting some kind of passage where, and this I think is important, the tunnel as a sculpture is of course one thing, as an object, but the only way to experience it is to go through it, which brings us back to what I said before about walking. It is the only way to see this tunnel is with our muscles. So I was trying to connect quasi-crystals, unpredictable crystal growth patterns, with our physical models, going against, let's say, the classicistic sort of kind of regime of spatial topologies. Oh my God, it's getting late. Huh?
No. We still have 20 minutes to go. Mirjam, you can grab your microphone. A question goes to you. I think talking about creating worlds, we should not forget the experiment, the ability of living in sort of a state of experiment, vielleicht eine experimentelle Seinslage. What is the experiment in your what role does experimenting have in your thinking, and can we live in constructed worlds?
We do live in constructive worlds, and we do construct worlds, not only to the better, as you could see the last days in Paris. So even if we talk like very abstractly about constructing worlds, we also have to talk about ideology, which is also a massive construction of a world, which is immunizing itself against doubt, against other thoughts, against objection, etc., etc. So maybe our talk seems to be very nice and smooth and about very nice and good things, but I'd like to mention a little bit bitterly that, of course, this abstract thinking about constructing worlds has very physical implications on people who really take it in a very radical way and take their construction for granted. So, of course, we talk here about the playfulness, and of course the playfulness in knowing that the construction is one and it could be the other one. And I think I'd like to talk about testing and experiencing, and of course involving other people into games. They're very much like Gadamer in his Method and Truth, which he wrote in 1960, where he really went back to what Schiller also pointed out, that people have to play in order to be humans. And this playfulness for me is linked to a certain lust to try out, to work with trial and error, to work with a kind of heuristics, I'd even say. So work with your findings, take something for serious, follow away, but be able to correct yourself, be able to think the other way around. And I think this is the beautiful saying of Francis Picabia, our head is round in order to think the other way around. So don't forget that human beings need this playfulness in order to, in order, I think you could even say you need this playfulness in order to lead a serious and a good life.
Well, thank you for bringing us back to our time today. I think maybe sort of a rounding question before we open it to the podium and then go together, hopefully, to see Baroque. How can we think about exactly this dissonance, between the incredible complex state of our world and the lack of ability to resolve problems of larger scale nature, and therefore devise policies and action that maybe add or lead to a form of betterment rather than to a collapse of civic society, maybe even, or at least a little shaking of it as we, I think, collectively experience it again and again. How do you deal with that? How can we even start thinking about this dissonance?
I think this is fundamentally related to the comments Mirjam has done just before, and that, of course, I completely agree with. If we speak about world making, ethics is important and inevitably comes into the game. And I have already noticed, for reasons that are very strange to me, that when you define yourself as a world maker, but each of us, I mean, not especially me or him, each of us as world makers, quite a lot of people react to that, identifying this proposal as a kind of extreme relativism. And relativism is dangerous because then everything is allowed and then the worst things we can imagine are justified. Of course, I disagree with that. And I very strongly disagree with that because I think this is just the opposite. First, everything is not the same, precisely. This is why if I were to make works of art instead of Olafur, that would be a disaster. I would never be invited anywhere because that would be horrible. So everything is not the same, precisely. But even deeper than that, that's just the other way around. I mean, understanding that we are the world makers and that some worlds are catastrophic is precisely an invitation not to conclude that then everything is allowed, but just the other way around, to conclude that what we think, and in the sequence that Olafur described, what we then make, but thinking is already a kind of making, makes sense. It will change the world. So conceiving ourselves as world maker is, in my opinion, everything but laxism. This is just the other way around. This is an invitation to responsibility.
And Olafur, to you the same question, but maybe in terms of ecological thinking. You know, again, this dissonance between what we know is the catastrophic condition of our ecological conditions and you know, the lack of adjustment that we see.
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and what I said before about the cultural sector somehow exercising this principle that people are smart, there's actually some seriousness to that in terms of, and I say cultural sector because it's too embarrassing to talk about myself all the time, but I'm currently quite occupied by this, well, what field are we in fact working in, and what is the sort of resources or the muscles of the field which we could call the cultural sector, right? And I would like to, you know, among several propositions, I think there's a few things that goes on there. One is that one can stand in front of a painting, let's say a painting, and then you look at the painting and then you realize, oh, that feeling, or you get that feeling from looking at the painting where you say, oh, I know that feeling. That painting is hosting or holding a feeling that I have, but before I looked at the painting I was not aware that I had it, but the painting made me realize that I had this feeling. So I'm simplifying it a little bit so that I understand it myself also, right? So suddenly you could say, well, actually the painting is seeing me, right? That's our little Baroque conundrum. So, and what is the resource in that is that I am being seen, right? I am being seen by a yet not discovered feeling that I carry within me, in a way that the feeling becomes to my attention. See, now this is almost a little bit therapeutic, you know? But it's just so interesting that in a cultural environment, and I think we know it from reading a book, you realize, oh, this is me. I know exactly what this feels like because I have the same feeling. But you were unaware until you read the book, right? So that is one, I think, very inclusive and very interesting exercise, because it is as if the painting does like this to you. Come, right? You are okay. Even the not so good feelings are also welcome, right? You did not feel well. Right now it gets very therapeutic. Do you see the principle of culture is just so interesting in that sense, because it brings to our attention who we are and with what effort we are existing. So that was one thing. The other thing is, you and I, Mirjam, now are in front of that painting, and then you have a different feeling. And actually you don't like the painting. You say, oh, I actually don't like that red color. And I say, oh, I love that red color. And it's so interesting, we can still be friends. And it's maybe even a success. You know, the fact that we disagree might be one of the greatest qualities of a museum like this. It's a success criteria that Mirjam and I will maybe even have an argument, but it's a great argument. You know, it's a success. But we wish the parliaments would be like this, that disagreeing would be kind of more productive instead of leading to exclusion, right? So the things that this idea of being seen has this inclusive potential, and it also has a collective potential, because it seems to suggest, well, disagreeing is in fact productive and a success for a cultural institution. So you asked then about, for instance, the ecology, and that's why I'm interested in people who are in fact verbalizing the agency or the intentionality of the painting. So I'm currently reading a little bit, and the way I do it is I'm inviting him to do a lecture with me, so I can sort of vampiristically steal all his, like I'm doing now with you, Aurélien. But Timothy Morton was in Stockholm at my show there, and of course he's famous for his total eradication of the subject, which I'm not totally comfortable with, right? But it's called, I believe, object-oriented ontology. And it's a lovely chap, and he works on ecology, and his famous book, I think, is called Ecology Without Nature, which I recommend. And it's very climate-oriented. And out of that, I've actually got a lot of inspiration. For instance, to a project that I hope to realize in Paris in 10 days' time, which is, of course, already very complex now. But the project is a lot of ice from Greenland. Big ice blocks. It's approximately 150 tons of ice. Very, very beautiful, large ice blocks, and they're noisy, crackling, and one can speak about them for a long time. But what is interesting, you look at the ice and you say, oh, it's ice. Right? It takes a sort of a nanosecond to establish what it is. Right? Oh, big chunks of ice. Then you go to the ice, and among many, many things, what happens, you put your hand on it, and you go, oh, it's cold. Right? And interestingly, of course, we knew that the ice was cold, but that was the thinking knowledge. But our hand did not remember, in this moment maybe just, how that felt. So it is connecting, what we know with how we physically are in the world. And this is a little bit like a kind of an anecdotal way of saying it, but you understand what I mean? The principle is that it is only, I believe, when we are physical about, for instance, the questions of ecology and the Anthropocene and the climate and so on, that we are in fact changing or acting or at least involved with it in theory. I know this academic principle that thinking is also doing, but just for the principle of actually change, I think that doing is still different than thinking about doing. Or at least for an artist, it would be horrible if we just sat and talked about, like my students, blah, 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 isn't this a great work of art? And I keep saying, no, it's an idea about a great work of art. Why don't you try to do it and see if a great work of art comes out of it? And it's so surprising, very often it is not the case. Sometimes another great work of art then comes out, and so on and so forth.
But Daniela?
Yes?
Well, Aurélien started with Kant in saying that his ideas about time and space were as wrong as those of Newton. But I think Kant is very right about what Olafur was mentioning about it. He even gives a reason, and it goes back to the playfulness. Why do people want that their aesthetic judgment is acknowledged by those they love? Why do we want that if we love the red, our partner should love the red too? And for Kant, it is of course not a quality in the red itself that is lovable, but it is a free and anti-hierarchical play within our own faculties, which is reason, which is imagination, which is sensuality itself. And it is this free play which decentralizes how we usually use our faculties, that is so enlivening. And this enlivening effect is what we want to share with our loves. But of course, the opposite can also happen. This play is not coming into being, and so surprise is quite an important means. So if we expect too much, we are often disappointed in the end. But if we don't expect too much, we can be the pride of surprise.
Elon Musk, the co-founder of PayPal and SpaceX entrepreneur, is suggesting, as I read, to build a colony on Mars very, very soon. I think he's speaking of 80,000 people who will live up there very soon. What do we think of that?
I think that's a bit pathetic. I mean, we are living in an incredible place. I mean, 5 billion years of extremely fragile evolution that we are right now destroying only in a few tenths of years, maybe in a few centuries. And I mean, in front of this craziness, trying to go away and probably break everything and make a disaster somewhere else, first, physically it seems completely impossible to me, but ethically, I mean, this is completely crazy. Everything, it's not completely too late to save most of what has been done up to now. But to see this answer right now put on the table seems to be the worst possible way of thinking.
What about you, Olafur? Would you like to live on Mars?
No, so I came up with a different strategy to go against Elon Musk, even though he seems to be going into batteries, which is also my most recently added field, the energy sector. So when I'm not an artist, I'm actually working in the energy sector like Elon. And it's so funny, I actually recently met him and anyway, different story. So the energy sector in which I am, it's in handheld power stations. This is a little power station, and as you might know, because I've been talking about it a lot already, this is a solar panel, so saving, not leaving. So you can choose, buy one of these, actually in the shop here for Christmas is very nice, or you can go to Mars. Right? So you have two strategies, and of course it does require a bit of sunlight, not like today, but essentially, I think, again, how does it feel to hold energy in your own hand, right? And it's not coming out of some undefined plug in the wall from where you have no relationship with what on earth is at the other end of the cable in the wall where that big machine is doing some kind of centralized energy, right? Probably fossil fuels or something like this. So anyway, so here you have a decentralization of energy, a threat to the kind of totalitarian centralized, which is of course not in Austria because people here own everything, but in many countries and so on and so forth. But it comes down to, well, is energy something that we are? Are we energetic? Right? You say that's a little bit what I'm interested in with this project. Is it actually empowering in terms of, well, energy is something that I produce myself, not necessarily by holding out a solar panel, but by being energetic in terms of, living as energy. And I loved your comment before we started that energy, everything is energy. Because so I immediately asked, couldn't you do a solar panel that recorded dark matter? And he said, you can't. So I was still working on getting beyond Elon Musk, because one has to give it, he's pretty entrepreneurial, of course.
Any questions from the public? Yes. I think there's somebody helping us.
Hello. Olafur, I'm passionate by order, and especially the effects of light and order. And the comment I would like to make is the world, the entire world, basically up to now, is a harmony between order and disorder. So the question if something is going to be ordered, it depends on the forces between the elements which are in the system. And this is how the physics work. So you have the solid phase, you have the gaseous phase, and you have transitions between the solid phase and the gaseous phase. The one is somehow perfectly ordered, and the other one is completely disordered. So I think this is the balance where we are. And my question to you, what about mirror neurons in your mirrors?
Yeah, so mirror neurons, of course, I was very interested in the fact that it made so much sense. And now you might have to look it up. There is a number of small YouTube films that explain mirror neurons very fast. But it's really based, it's considered as a sort of principle out of which empathic patterns can grow. So identifications in terms of mirroring somebody else's, for instance, somebody's emotional state. Of course, that does not necessarily, empathy doesn't, if you have sympathy, empathy, and then compassion. So empathy is your ability to put yourself in the shoes of another. Also when the other is suffering and you know how to make him suffer more. So empathy is not just, as we sometimes think, the good thing. Empathy is just our ability to, also if you torture somebody, you have to understand how to be efficient in that too, right? So the empathy so the mirror neurons, but now then there seems to be some people who are introducing a theory against the mirror neuron theory, which is also then very interesting. Talking about the one idea replacing the other. So maybe what is more relevant for me to say, I as an artist, I follow these in a not so scientific way, I have to admit. I follow these principles where our, where the gaze and senses meets social science. So mirror neuron was interesting for me because it was about our ability to take in the emotional state of the world and act upon it. That's how I came to it and started to think about how I could use it in my work.
Any other questions? Questions from the public? Yes, please. It feels like we covered it all. Fine.
If you said before that you put the mirror, this reminds me at doubling the space, like the ancient Egyptians were doubling the space. It was, it's also a symbol for the five-dimensional space. And like you're using the grid of the almond bars for the tunnel. So is it something that you are suggesting to science the higher dimensional space, and to put something against, if you hear that they are still believing in something like time travel?
Yeah, that's true. It was called Amann lines. The Englishman was called Amann. But no, I don't. The way I see it, I think of what comes out of science is something that I maybe even just cut and paste in a very vampiristic way. So I say, oh, that's a great idea. I just take that. I use it for a work of art. So, and I'm sorry for being so incredibly uncreative, but so I said, oh, these lines are great. I love them. They're very beautiful. And then they are also interesting. Why don't I just do a tunnel? So, whoops, made a work of art. Good day. And but the thing is, of course, I'm very interested in how is science trying to verbalize the non-verbalizable. I'm so interested. So I'm actually very interested in how can you think about the unthinkable, right? The imagination required to do what you are doing is in a way, for me it's so easy. I just take the lines and put it on a tunnel. But you have to sort of think about something which is, by its nature, beyond thinking. So I'm so curious about dark matter, and I keep asking, well, is it, can you hold it? That's very interesting. Could I make a sculpture of dark matter? Could I put it in space? Can you, if you and I are here and there's dark matter, can we call each other on the phone? I'm just trying to, and I'm not really so interested, I'm very interested in how he explains. Because that is, I think, so creative. Then he says all kinds of crazy things that I say, oh, it's so beautiful, it's so inspiring. So I'm absolutely not, a critical or against science. I'm really using science to enhance my own or amplify my let's say, sense of creativity, or self-esteem, really, or confidence. So in that way, I am, I know I had prepared that I won't ask now. It takes too long. What's the difference between the spaghetti effect and the pancake effect? Well, how exciting is that question, right? So Peter Weibel actually introduced me to a person called Otto Rössler, and somebody might know him here, but he always told me that how long time does it take for an astronaut to jump out of a black hole? Should there be a trampoline in the bottom? And then he said, oh, approximately a day. Except for the people who are not in the black hole, it will take forever. And it really took me, and this is now 10 years ago, it really took me 10 years to understand, my God, he's right. So I actually do learn something from science. And I mean, he's relatively right. And now there's even a movie about it, which I think is not a bad movie. There's two movies. First, there's this movie, what is it, Interstellar? Not a bad movie, I think. Not much better than the two other ones. They were really horrible. The Mars was really bad, and then the Gravity was sort of in the middle, right? But then there will be a fourth movie soon. The fourth movie. Does it have a title?
Not really.
Oh, but our
Wishing Well.
Yeah, Wishing Well. Oh, but our common friend, and this is how we know each other, Claire Denis, a French filmmaker who's just so amazing, and so of course it will be by far the best of the four movies, or better than the three. Claire Denis has for some years already now consulted you on scientific matter for researching for her film, which is a love story, and it's being, oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. Anyway, Sadie Smith is doing the script. Is that her name, right? Sadie Smith. And so this is how we met. I'm supposed to do the set, the sort of the coulissen for this, which is so exciting because, of course, you can actually tell what it sort of looks like, and I'm just making something up, right? So it's very interesting. This is where our collaboration actually. This is where we know each other.
I can see we are at the end of our allocated time. This was an amazing panel.
It depends on the referential.
Well, it depends on our points of reference. Yes, absolutely. It was an amazing panel. Thank you for coming. Olafur Eliasson, Mirjam.